That is so interesting. I've only ever seen a few blue snow geese. That is so cool. It's their relationship with agriculture is very interesting. Yeah. Mm. That's yet so in I used to work in Kansas and they used to do a similar thing, not just for snow geese, for Canada geese and but they'll leave the stubble, you know. Excuse me? Oh, I'm moving back to Texas. Yeah, I just got my PhD, so I'm gonna move back to Texas and work as a postdoc there. Oh, I would love that. I will let you know. Absolutely. They do move all through that. I'm continuing my research here. So I'm continuing as a postdoc, but I'm just gonna work remotely in Texas so that I can be with my family. Yeah. But yeah, what a cool species. Uh, yeah. I love purple gallinules. They are, yeah. You'll see them up high. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. Oh man, I love seeing them. Have you ever been to Sweetwater Wetlands Park? Yeah. Well, that's where I go, and I love walking that boardwalk, and a lot of times you'll see the purples in there. Yeah. Not too much. I think I saw one earlier, but that's about it. Oh, I see. Hawks? Oh, they closed it off for a long time, actually. Yeah. I mean, they're invasive, you know. Yeah, yeah. It's kind of a PR thing, I think, you know. But I mean, it happens a lot, you know.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Well, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. If you have a cell phone, if you could please silence it, would be greatly appreciated. If you are on Zoom, you are muted. Please stay muted. If you have questions for the speaker, put it in the chat. I'll monitor that for you and get you some answers. Walter Wynn is here. He's going to introduce our speaker.
Good morning. This is the sixth of our series, and next week will be the seventh presentation of the six that we're doing because for the last 3 years, while I look for students, I've been lucky to find seven. So today we have Chris Gulick here, and he's a recent PhD. Yay!
Thank you.
And he's a postdoc until this fall. And he'll tell us more about why he's studying these white birds. And he has a sample here. And here you go, Chris. Thank you very much for being here.
Well, thank you, Walter, and thank you, Pam. Thank you all for coming to my talk and inviting me here. I'm very excited to. Okay, let me try. All right, all right. Now I'm taking my hand off. All right, thank you. But I appreciate everyone coming out, and thank you for inviting me here. I love getting a chance to talk about these birds. So today I'm going to be talking about a lot of my PhD research over the last 5 to 6 years. And it's going to be focused on what we can learn from the movements of the white ibis, this really interesting wading bird that you find throughout Florida and the Southeast. Um, but first, I want to do a little background and kind of show you where I'm coming from. I got my bachelor's degree from Texas Tech in 2016. And there I started working in some labs and volunteering as interns. I was studying raptors, things like red-tailed hawks and American kestrels, and also ducks, things like the black-bellied whistling duck, which you'll see here as well. And I developed a really keen interest in birds and understanding wildlife. And from there, I went to Kansas State University, and I got my master's degree there in 2019. I studied the lesser prairie chicken in Kansas and how it responded to landscape changes and how it responded to changes in grazing management. This is an endangered species, so there's a lot of focus on how we can conserve it. Then I moved to Florida, and I started studying a bird that couldn't be any more different from the lesser prairie chicken. It's the white ibis. The white ibis is a wetland bird. It's got a long bill and long legs, which allow it to wade into shallow water and find prey. And it's got a lot of really interesting adaptations that make it very unique to study, but also really important for conservation. And I'll get into that in a bit. But the common thread throughout all of this has been ornithology, the study of birds, movement ecology, how we can leverage understanding of movement to understand species and ecosystems, and then all of that wrapped in the package of conservation and management. What can we do to help understand and manage these species that we're studying? Oh, you're okay. So now I'd like to move into the background of this project. It all started with the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010. And for those of you that don't know, it was the largest and most damaging ecological disaster in the history of our country. It dumped about 210 billion gallons of oil into the northern Gulf of Mexico, and it did extensive damage to coastal environments in the northern Gulf. And going into this project, we had some questions about how wildlife, how wild bird species were responding to this disaster. But the problem was we didn't really have great data on the movement of these birds prior to the oil spill. So it was hard for us to really understand how that oil spill impacted them. So we decided to apply for a grant and go out to study the white ibis, which breeds in coastal environments in the northern Gulf, to determine how it might be impacted by this disaster or by future disasters like this. So why the white ibis? You know, there are a lot of coastal birds. There's a lot of coastal wading birds. Why should I pick this one? You know, a lot of people see the ibis as a very common species. For those of you that don't know, it's about this size. And I'll go into why I have this later, but it's, you know, medium size, about the size of a football. And it forages in wetlands, but you can also find it in a lot of other places. You can find it often in yards or lawns, sometimes in roadside ditches looking for food, even in parking lots or behind a McDonald's, right? So why should we study these birds? Well, they're common, but like a lot of other common things in the world, they're very interesting and valuable and unique. And in particular, they have some really cool adaptations. They move very long distances. They range widely throughout the southeastern United States, and they're considered nomads, where the general consensus is that they rarely stay in one place for a very long time. They also aggregate in these big social groupings. If an ibis sees a group of other ibises, it'll come in to forage. It says, hey, you know, if these guys are finding food, there's probably food there for me too. So because they aggregate like that, they're very useful as an indicator of how a wetland is doing. So if you manage a wetland complex and you see a lot of ibises there, that's a pretty good clue that you're doing a good job with managing that ecosystem. So despite this importance, their population regulation is really not well understood. So going into this project, we wanted to think about what we can answer with kind of a movement ecology approach. We wanted to first identify broad movement patterns of the species to figure out if it's as nomadic as we previously thought. Second, we wanted to understand if this population was stable, increasing, or declining, which is often very important in conservation and management. And then lastly, we wanted to understand what other regions of the Southeast, outside of our sampling area where we captured these birds, what other regions support this population? And we can answer all of these questions by tracking bird movements. So just to answer the question on the first slide, we can answer all of these just by tracking these birds. But before we track the birds, we have to put transmitters on them. And before we put transmitters on them, we have to go out and capture them. And boy, is it difficult to capture these birds. Capturing birds in general is hard because they do fly, and they often don't let you get very close. But we went out to these two islands in coastal Alabama. And these two islands host really large breeding colonies of ibises and other wading birds. So it's a pretty significant area for that, that population of birds. We went out to these two islands with the objective of capturing and tagging these birds and then releasing them so we could track them. So how do you catch an ibis? Well, if you're catching a young bird that hasn't developed its feathers fully yet, it's pretty simple. You just go into the colony and you can catch them by hand or by net. You often get pretty muddy doing it, but it's fairly easy. But what about the adults? Well, you can go into the colonies and you can put traps on nests to capture the adults as they come back to their young. But we don't like doing that too much because it disturbs the birds, and it can just disturb other birds in the colony as well. So we wanted to find a way of capturing these birds outside of the colony. And to do that, we really need to know where they're going, or we need to have a way of attracting them to an area so that we can capture them. So how do we do that? Well, it started by going to every Lowe's, Home Depot, and Ace Hardware within about 30 miles of Gainesville and buying every pink plastic lawn flamingo that we could find. We got a lot of weird stares with shopping carts full of these things, but it did pay off. We took these birds and we painted them to try and make them look as much like ibises as possible. This is an example in the flesh. Does this look like an ibis? I don't know. You be the judge. But if you're an ibis, it looks close enough that they'll fly in to get a closer look. Again, these are social birds, so if they see other ibises, they want to investigate. So to an ibis, yeah, it looks close enough apparently. So we took these decoys and we put them out in the marsh. And we put them in a big group to make other ibises think, hey, there might be some really good food here. And then we set these nets up on either side of them. So the ibises would see our decoys. They'd get really curious. They'd fly in and get caught in the net. And then we'd fish them out of the net and we'd put on our transmitters. This is actually a different species that I also studied. I don't have time to talk about that species today, but we pull them out of the net and we put on these transmitters. So we captured about 44 ibises across both of these coastal Alabama breeding colonies. This is one of my fantastic technicians holding one of our birds. You can actually see the transmitter on the bird. It's mounted like a backpack with these two harnesses over the shoulders. And it can help us track these birds for up to 4 years. So we went out for 3 summers, 2020 through 2022. We tagged these birds and we tracked them through 2024. And we tried to capture a variety of age classes to see how the movements change based on age. And we ended up with this sample size. So now that we've caught these birds and tracked them, what do we do with them? So that brings me to the first question. What are these birds' movement patterns? And before I go into that, I want to describe a spectrum in movement ecology. The spectrum ranges from philopatry, which is very consistent movements, individuals returning to the same breeding site year after year. And on the opposite end of the spectrum is dispersal. And with dispersing birds, they are going to go to different locations year after year. So every individual, every animal exists on this spectrum. And depending on where they are, we can kind of predict how local changes in habitat, things like an oil spill or hurricane, how that might impact these birds. If they're philopatric and they're returning to the same area year after year after year, we would expect those declines in habitat to have a greater impact on those populations because they keep coming back to it. Whereas for birds that are dispersing year after year, for what we might consider a nomadic species, it would probably have less of an impact because they might only spend 1 year in the area that's been impacted. So we wanted to kind of approach 2 questions. First, are white ibises more likely to disperse from their capture site or to return? And then second, what factors drive displacement of these birds from breeding colonies? So to do this, we again tracked these birds across multiple years, and then we looked at their movements across an entire year from one breeding season to the next, and we categorized it as a dispersing movement pattern, a philopatric or returning movement pattern, and then we also looked to see if there was behavioral switching, if they dispersed in one year but were philopatric in the next. And then we categorized this. So going in, these birds are thought to be philopatric, so we would expect mostly dispersing birds. This is an example of what that looks like. This bird dispersed in the top, and you can see in yellow, it established a home range in coastal Alabama in the first year that it was tracked. And then in the next breeding season, it moved to coastal Louisiana near Lake Pontchartrain, and it established a home range there. And then in the year after that, it moved all the way to the Florida Panhandle, somewhat near Tallahassee, and established home ranges there. So this is a great example of a bird that disperses in each year after it's been tagged. Down below, we have the exact opposite. This bird is returning to the same spot year after year. In 2020, it established a home range in coastal Alabama, went to Tampa during the winter time, and then at the same time the next year came back to coastal Alabama, and then went back to Tampa in the following year and returned. So this bird is philopatric both to its breeding and its non-breeding areas. And ibises are displaying both patterns. There's a lot of variability here. So we added all these up, and we found that for young birds, most of our birds actually displayed philopatric patterns in 1 year that they were tracked. Most of our juveniles would leave in 1 year, and during their subadult year, when they're not yet old enough to breed, they often have a home range somewhere else, and then they come back once they reach adulthood. Our subadults all return back to coastal Alabama in all subsequent seasons that they were tracked. And just so we're clear, the juveniles, that's their first year of life, subadults second, and then adults is their third year or after. For our adults, again, most birds were philopatric in at least 1 year that we tracked them. So we're actually finding the opposite pattern to what we expected. These birds are returning to coastal Alabama much more than we thought. We also looked at what drives displacement. So for the birds that are leaving, why are they leaving, and which ones are more likely to leave? So ignore the equation on top. That's just what I used to get this plot. But what we found is that the best explanations of dispersal in this species were sex and mass. So larger birds were less likely to disperse from coastal Alabama. So the bigger the bird was, the less likely it was to leave coastal Alabama. And then we also found that females were more likely to stay near the capture site in Alabama compared to males. We found that the relationship between sex and mass is also really, really strong for males, less so for females. So what's going on here? Well, dispersal is pretty common in birds, as I've kind of previously hinted at, but male dispersal is relatively rare. It's usually the females that are dispersing to find new areas. In this species, these birds are monogamous, and males will often really compete heavily for access to mates before they breed. So they'll go to a colony, and these males will just start fighting each other, showing off, trying to get the attention of females. I'm sure we've seen that kind of behavior in humans from time to time as well. But they'll fight each other, and usually the larger birds will win those fights. During breeding, both males and females will defend their nest. Often these colonies are so crowded with birds that the area required for a nest becomes a really important resource. So again, larger birds are more likely to defend those nests. So what we think is happening is that these larger birds are pushing out the smaller birds. They're out-competing them in these contests, and that's what's driving these smaller birds to disperse further from coastal Alabama. Again, this is pretty important to understand from a management perspective, because it's really important to know which individuals are staying local and why. So what does this mean for the local breeding population? Again, local changes in habitat. Think about an oil spill in coastal Alabama will have a larger impact on individuals than we previously thought, because they're returning to Alabama year after year. Additionally, females might be more impacted by these changes because they're much more likely to stay nearby than males. This brings me to the second part of my talk, another piece of information that we can gain from understanding ibis movements. This relates to survival and populations. So these birds are capable of some really massive population changes. This is from a breeding colony in the Florida Everglades, which is a major stronghold for this species. And they can go from a few hundred birds at a breeding colony to up to 40,000 birds in 1 year. So some really massive fluctuations, but we don't really understand why that's occurring. So we don't really understand individual survival very well, and that can really inform this. Most data on ibises, because they move around so much, is count. So you go to a colony, you count the number of birds. Individual survival estimates can really help not only understand the species, but it can actually be used for conservation by helping us understand if populations are stable or not. So kind of skipping methods here, if you do have questions about methods, please feel free to ask. But we built survival models to figure out, how likely these birds are to survive a year. And we found that for a juvenile, pretty much best case scenario, it's a coin flip. So it's pretty bleak for juveniles. They only have maximum about 50% chance of surviving a year. Once these birds get to their second year of life, they have about a 75% chance. Some survive a really long time, others don't. And then once they reach adulthood, they start having a slightly better chance of survival, but the variation is a lot tighter. So things are a lot more stable for adults. And this is a pretty common pattern to see in a long-lived bird species, which the ibis is a long-lived bird species. So why does this matter? Well, first, this is the first study to estimate annual survival of these birds, which is something that I'm pretty pleased with. We also kind of figured out maybe where a weakness is for this population in this juvenile period. And this could be because these young birds are inexperienced. They don't know where the good habitat is. They may not be good at getting food. It also could be because they're increasing their energy expenditures, spending a lot of energy on these dispersal movements, right? So why does survival matter? Well, survival can actually help us understand these populations. All populations can basically be boiled down to 4 different factors, levers that decide if the population is increasing, decreasing, or stable. On one hand, we have births and deaths. If there are more births than deaths, the population is increasing. If not, it's decreasing. And then we have immigration, which is movement into the population, and emigration, which is movement out. Again, if there are more immigrants than immigrants, the population is increasing. If not, it's decreasing. So we have data on reproduction and survival. We have survival data from our study. We found reproductive data from other studies that have been done in the past. We don't have great information on movements into this study area from other sites, just because not a lot of people have tracked these birds in other areas. So we can actually use births and deaths to understand if the population is stable. And we use what's called a matrix population model to do this. Basically, what you need to understand about this plot, we ran many simulations, about 10,000 different simulations, and each of these bars represent how common each level of stability is across the simulations. If the population, or if the simulations are orange, so above 1, that means that they're stable or increasing, and that's good. We want that. If they're blue, that means that they're not stable and they're decreasing. In only about 33% of our simulations, we found that the population was stable or increasing. So that's really not good. We want that number to be at or above 0, or at or above 1 most of the time. So what's going on here? Well, despite what we found, the population in coastal Alabama, at least recently, has remained somewhat stable. So why does our model, which is built on good data, disagree with observations made in the field? Well, for one, recent events may have caused a decline. This could be changes in habitat. This could be natural disasters like hurricanes, or it could be human-caused disasters, again, like oil spills. Or immigration from other areas of their range may be stabilizing this population. So this is what's called a rescue effect. So imagine that our circle in red is our breeding population, and they're declining. There are more deaths than there are births, but there are 2 major strongholds of ibises across the southeast. One is in, can y'all hear me okay? All right. One is in South Florida in the Florida Everglades, and one is in South Louisiana at the mouth of the Mississippi River. So imagine that these two populations are doing really well, but our population in Alabama is doing poorly. Well, if those birds from the good populations, the increasing populations, just move to our area, it can stabilize that. So we actually think that's what's going on. These green areas are rescuing our population, which is in a gradual decline. And this brings us to the third part of our talk, the network analysis. Network analysis kind of works well with this understanding of population dynamics. But before I get into what exactly a network analysis is, I want to talk somewhat about the adaptations of these birds. Ibises are what's known as tactile foragers. And that means that instead of usually looking around for prey before they capture it, they actually feel with their bills to try and find the prey blindly. And this is really good in some conditions and really bad in others, right? It's good when visibility is low. It's great in muddy and murky conditions when wetlands don't have clear visibility and these birds can just kind of feel around and find their food. It's also great for finding creatures that are buried in the sediment, and these are some of the ibis's main prey species, things like crayfish and fiddler crabs. But as you can imagine, it's really inefficient at low prey density. So if you can imagine just sort of blindfolding yourself and feeling around in your refrigerator for a food that you might want to eat, that'd be a lot easier if there was a lot of that food densely packed in the fridge, right? So once prey populations get low enough, this method of finding food is really inefficient, and ibises leave. These birds also have a fresh water requirement during the breeding season. So ibises have these cool glands in their head that allow them to expel salt from their prey. Things like crayfish and fiddler crabs will actually match the salinity of their environment. So if the crayfish is in a salty area, it's salty. If it's in a non-salty area, then it's not. And these birds can't handle too much salt. So if they find food in a salty environment, they'll eat it, and then they'll extrude the salt from these glands near their bill. Unfortunately, the young birds, the nestlings, do not develop these glands until basically 30 days after they've hatched. And this means that ibises that have young during the breeding season, they need to find prey from freshwater environments. And if they don't, their nestlings might starve or they might die. So all of this means that ibises have very specific conditions that they need in order to be efficient foragers. So I want to talk a little bit about actually what creates those conditions. For an ibis, the ideal year, we have a lot of pre-breeding rainfall. So before they start breeding, rainfall is really high. And this is going to fill up wetlands, and it's going to allow fish populations and shellfish populations to increase really rapidly. Following that, we get a really long dry down period during the breeding season. And what this does is slowly reduce those water levels. So we have a lot of prey that's being consolidated in smaller and smaller pools of water. Essentially, this is fish in a barrel. So this is the ideal condition for ibises, but how often does this actually happen? Unfortunately for these birds, the answer is relatively infrequently. This is a plot of precipitation and rainfall in the Florida Everglades. And you can see these little spikes on the red line every 1 to 3 years. This means that basically rainfall is changing pretty significantly on the 1 to 5 year scale. And then at the decadal scale, we see these really massive fluctuations in water levels. So this means that at both short and long time scales, the habitat that ibises need in order to be successful is very unpredictable. And it's not only unpredictable in time, but also in space. So if an ibis is moving through an area, it's relatively hard to find that good habitat. So how do they deal with that? Well, as I said earlier, they have adaptations. Sometimes they don't even look for habitat. They look for other ibises. And if they see ibises, they say, oh, there's probably good food here, and they move down. They also move a lot. They have really long distance movements that allow them to cover a lot of ground and search for that habitat. The big takeaway here is that ibises need to move around across a large area to find good habitat. And they also need to move around a lot to rescue other populations. So these arrows here are actually a little bit inaccurate. If a bird is moving from the Florida Everglades to coastal Alabama, it's not going to do it all in one flight. It's going to stop at many locations along the way. So rather than this plot, it's actually going to look something like this, where a bird might move a short distance, stop at an area, stay there for a few days, rest, refuel, and then keep moving. So again, if we know that rescue effects are really important for this population, and we know that in order to have rescue effects, these birds need to stop at a lot of different, basically rest stops along the way, then what we know is that to keep this population stable, we need a lot of different habitat across the Southeast. In other words, if areas are not well connected, these rescue effects cannot occur, and our population in coastal Alabama will likely decline a lot more steeply than it already is. So we can use a network approach to kind of try to understand these dynamics. Networks are really useful for summarizing movement across large areas, and they can also help us identify important areas, places where individuals are traveling to very frequently, and also regions that are very important for connectivity. So we can use these network analyses to answer a couple questions. First, what areas do ibises visit as they move through the Southeast, as they're moving to these rescue areas? And second, how do these areas, or as I'll call them nodes, contribute to the connectivity of all habitat across their range? So to answer this question, we first started with all of the movements for all of our ibises across the Southeast. And thank you for moving these captions. I'm sorry, you're moving them around a lot, but I appreciate it. This is a lot of movements. It's kind of a chaotic map. We can actually learn a lot from this map. You know, we know these birds are mostly sticking to coastal environments. Surprisingly, they're really not going to the Atlantic coast at all. And the reason that's surprising is because we know there are year-round populations of ibises from South Florida to the Carolinas on the Atlantic coast. But for whatever reason, the birds that we captured in Alabama didn't move there at all. So that definitely is a standout. But in general, they're staying to coastal areas and river basins. There's a few areas that are concentrating in terms of their movement, but obviously we want to take this a step further. So for each bird, we found all of the areas where it stopped to rest and recharge, and we did this by looking at those movement tracks. And we got the geographic center of each of those areas and plotted them on the map. This might be a little hard to see, but each of these dots represents one of those home ranges for one of the birds that we tracked across the Southeast. And then we took these and we aggregated them into larger areas to try and find these rest stops, or these regions that ibises are staying at quite a bit more than other parts of the Southeast. And that turns into these polygons. So each of these 11 shapes represents an area that ibises that we tracked are spending a lot of time as they move throughout the Southeast. And this tells us that each of these areas might be particularly important to them for, again, finding food, for resting and recharging. So we can actually use these to build our network. A network is comprised of nodes, which are these circles, and it's comprised of edges, which are the lines that connect the circles. The size of the circle indicates how much time birds are spending at each of these regions in terms of number of days. So a larger circle means that birds are spending more time in that region. The edges represent individual movements between two regions, and these are direct movements. So if there's no line between two nodes, no birds are moving directly between those nodes. Instead, they're stopping at different regions along the way. A darker colored line means that more birds are making those trips, And a lighter colored line means that there are relatively few direct movements between those two regions. So we can actually use these to build and understand spatial networks. I want to also note the capture site, coastal Alabama, is the largest circle. So again, these birds are returning back to coastal Alabama. That's not particularly surprising, but it's also important to note that they're spending most of their time back in coastal Alabama. Again, if there was to be another oil spill or hurricane, that does not bode well for these birds in Alabama. So we wanted to understand where these birds were visiting most. And to do that, we looked at something called in-degree centrality. In-degree centrality tells us which regions are ibises making the most trips into. So as they're traveling to and from each of these different places, which of these regions has the most inbound movement? And we found that coastal Alabama, southern Louisiana, and the Pensacola River Basin were our top 3 nodes. So these areas represent a lot of concentrated movements for these birds. It seems like birds are really moving into these areas. So that's really important from a management perspective because we can really understand if we want to conserve birds in coastal Alabama and they're moving outside of coastal Alabama, what other regions might be, most important beyond that area, that initial area. But we also wanted to look at connectivity. Imagine, again, that you're a bird in the Everglades and you want to move to coastal Alabama. We want to know which nodes these birds are most likely to stop at as they make that journey. So the darker these nodes are, the darker the orange, the more important this region is for centrality or for movement through the network. Essentially, it's measuring how often each of the shortest paths through the network pass through that region. So our top 3 regions are coastal Alabama, again, the Pensacola region, which is coming out as very important, and also kind of south central Louisiana near the Chaffalaya Basin. But what you might see in this particular plot is that the smaller nodes are actually most important for centrality, with the exception of coastal Alabama. So birds are not necessarily spending a lot of time in these different areas, but they're stopping there and then moving on to different areas. So each of these small nodes is essentially acting as a way station that allows birds to move through the area, to find food, to find good habitat, and potentially to provide these rescue effects that are important for population stability. So just to wrap all that up, we found a really wide extent to the network. They moved throughout most of the Southeast, but they really didn't travel all that much to the Florida Everglades, which is a major stronghold for the species, and they really didn't move to the Atlantic coast at all. And this tells us that there may be some kind of divide there where maybe Atlantic coast birds don't quite move too much to the Gulf, and Gulf birds don't quite move too much to the Atlantic. We did find really strong connectivity to Louisiana. Over and over again, birds are spending a lot of time in Louisiana. They're moving into Louisiana. And areas in Louisiana are really important for connectivity. So that really tells us that interstate cooperation would probably be necessary to continue conserving and managing this species. And lastly, small nodes, in other words, areas where ibises are not spending a lot of time, they shouldn't necessarily be underestimated. Those areas could still be really important for facilitating movement and, again, rescue effects. So wrapping all of this up, what all did we learn from the movements of white ibises? First, these birds are much more phylopatric than we expected, and that tells us that local changes in habitat may have a greater effect on individuals than we previously thought. So again, if another oil spill comes, that's going to be pretty bad news for these birds in coastal Alabama. Additionally, we found that males are dispersing further than females, and this tells us that declines in habitat may disproportionately affect females in the population. We found that survival is low for juveniles, but relatively high for older age classes like adults, and that survival stabilizes as age increases. So we use that to also figure out that the population is gradually declining without these rescue effects. So this population in coastal Alabama is likely very reliant on rescue effects from other parts of the Southeast. And then lastly, maintaining habitat across a really large region of the Southeast may be necessary to facilitate these rescue effects and to allow that population to stay consistent over a long period of time. So with that, I'd like to thank all the people that contributed to this project, all of our collaborators, the people that provided support and funding, the Alabama Trustee Implementation Group, my advisor, Abby Powell, and all the many people that contributed to this. And with that, I can answer any questions that you might have. If you want to email me, you can also do that. My email is up on the screen.
Thank you very much. Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there questions from the audience? Of course.
Yeah.
I saw your hand first, Jane.
Oh, okay.
Hi, thanks very much. So the animals, I guess, are breeding in Louisiana, and you also explained that they have very specific requirements when breeding. I know about them because they go out to Seahorse Key and used to,
Yeah.
and so I've watched a lot of them, and they have very specific requirements, and they actually have to come inland if they're out on saltwater. They have to come inland to get food for their kids. So maybe, that's kind of another, this is my asking a question. Maybe that's another requirement in that they're getting maybe a good place to nest in coastal Alabama, but it's not a very good place for them to live the whole year, and so they go elsewhere. Well, anyway, something along those lines. It seems like that issue of nesting someplace different from what was necessarily good for his adulthood might be an important factor.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And one thing that I really didn't mention is, why coastal Alabama? Well, these birds like nesting on islands because these islands act as natural defenses against predators that would eat their eggs or their young. So it's basically like a really big moat. And it prevents things like skunks and raccoons and other mammals from swimming over to the island and eating their young. So there are definitely benefits to nesting in that salty ocean environment, but there are definitely downsides too. And there's actually some really interesting research that shows that ibises have a symbiotic relationship with alligators. So in places like the Everglades, ibises will intentionally nest over alligators. And alligators will intentionally move to areas where ibises are nesting. And what's going on is that the ibises are protected from things like skunks and raccoons by the alligators. No skunk or raccoon is going to go anywhere near an alligator, and if they do, they're going to get eaten. The alligators benefit because if a nestling falls out of the nest, it gets fed. And so it's kind of a cruel nature effect, but there is a symbiotic relationship happening there. But yeah, that's a really good point. That's a little bit of a sidetrack, but yeah. Snakes too, yeah, and the Burmese python in the Everglades are a major problem for these birds.
I'm going to ask a backwards question for you.
Sure.
You're talking about why they're coming in. I want to know why they're going out. So let's just look at the Everglades for a minute. Are they, many other animals, the females will, find places, and then the males are leaving because they don't get a female. They don't get a territory, a breeding territory or a feeding territory. And are they running out of good territory in these places from which they are moving, and then they are looking for places? So I want to know if more males or females are moving, and is it because they're running out of place? And most animals, the young ones get, a certain amount of them will get kicked out and they go looking.
That's a really good question. In general, from what we've found, males are more likely to be the ones to make those movements and to establish new territories elsewhere. On top of that, juveniles, young birds, they almost always either get kicked out or they move out voluntarily, because what an Ibis wants to do is try to get a catalog of the entire surrounding area so that it knows where the good areas to feed are. And we think that these young birds, they make these big movements, and we think that they're actually making these movements to try and figure out, they're kind of just exploring and looking around. Unfortunately not. They have to rely on other birds. So it's almost like if you're driving past a few restaurants and you see the parking lot is almost full at one, that tells you, hey, that's probably a pretty good spot, and you're more likely to stop there. Yeah, oh, that's a great question. And to answer your question, the reason, if most of the time, if these birds are leaving at all, we think that reason is because that area is no longer good for nesting. So let's say in, I believe in 2021, habitat in the Everglades was perfect for ibises. There was a lot of food. It was very easy to get. And because of that, there were record numbers of white ibis nesting. I don't think we had seen that many ibis nesting in the Everglades in about 80 to 100 years. The next year, it was not very good at all. So we didn't have the pre-breeding rainfall. We didn't have the breeding season dry down, which meant that while habitat was really good one year, it was terrible the next. So what that did is it created a large number of ibises in 2021. A lot were born, but then they didn't want to stay, so they moved out. So in a weird way, habitat sometimes doing really bad in the Everglades may actually be really good for places like coastal Alabama because they move out. But yeah, that's a great question.
Thank you. That was a very interesting. Is this working? That was a very interesting talk. I of course, need to ask on the data side. You had said yeah, you had a sample of 44, but your bar chart only showed 22.
Oh, yeah, okay. So that was actually a subset of the data. So we captured 44 birds and tracked 44 birds. But in order to determine if a bird dispersed or was philopatric, it had to survive and be tracked for at least 1 year. So in other words, the bird had to be tracked in year 1, so we knew where it was during that breeding season. And in the following breeding season, we had to know if it came back or it moved to a different spot. And if you notice, juvenile survival was really low. So 22 of those birds did not survive a full year. And so we couldn't say if the bird was dispersing or not because it didn't survive long enough for us to understand that. But that's a great question.
So you had 3 age categories. What was the distribution of sample size across the 3?
We only had, I think, about 2 subadults. They were relatively hard to find. We had, I don't remember the exact split, but we had slightly more juvenile birds than we did adult birds. Just because, again, these adult birds are extremely hard to
Right,
capture.
yeah.
So, yeah.
So what I'm hearing then is that if you lost the signal, you assume death. Is that correct? Because you said they didn't survive.
Right. So, yes and no. We were pretty confident. The transmitters that we have, they tell us the location of the bird, but they also give us other pieces of data. Things like battery voltage. They tell us there's a little activity monitor in the transmitter, and every time the bird moves, even if it doesn't, move left or right, if it just makes any kind of movement, it'll tell us that the bird is moving. So if we find that the activity monitor stops, or if the bird stops being tracked, then we can be fairly certain that that's because the bird died.
So there was no way they were going to fall off then?
No,
Okay.
no.
So what data did you use as input to your population matrix model? Because if you only had 2 subadults, how did you do the probabilities of transitioning to adult?
Oh, that's a great question. That's awesome. Man, that's a really
Sorry, I know just enough to be dangerous.
yeah, no, you're good. So our matrix population model was a 3-stage Leslie matrix.
Mhm.
Birds started as juveniles, transitioned to subadults, and then transitioned to adults, at which point they had to survive and then breed, or excuse me, breed and then survive. So what we did is we took our survival probabilities. If you remember, our survival probabilities for juveniles was, about 25. For subadults, it was about, 65. And for adults, it was roughly about 80. And we took those and we basically put them into our Leslie matrix, but we added some stochastic variation. And so when we ran that model, we would randomly pull a number for survival across that, and then we'd randomly pull a number for productivity, and then we could get the output, was the population stable or not. And then we did that 10,000 times.
So the only question I have then is, where did the productivity data come from? How did you know birth, that side of it?
Yeah, no, yeah, this
I mean,
is
did
like
you go
my,
count eggs or
Yeah.
something?
Yeah, I was about to say this is like my defense. No, no, I seriously, I really love the questions. I appreciate it. The data, so I called it productivity or reproductive output. In the wildlife field, we call it fecundity, which is essentially the number of juveniles that are produced per female per year. And there are a lot of factors that go into that. How likely is a female to nest every year that it's an adult? How many eggs does it produce? How likely are the eggs to make it to the hatching stage? How many nestlings make it to the fledgling stage? And so on and so forth. What's the sex ratio of the young? And so we found each of those from the literature. We actually found a lot of different measurements. A lot of people have looked at productivity of ibises, and we were able to build a distribution based off of that. But yeah, that's a very perceptive question. Thank you.
Is Peter Frederick still there, or has he moved on?
Peter was on my committee. Peter is like, what a great guy. And a lot of what you saw, he was in the acknowledgments. A lot of what you saw was with the help and advice of Peter. This is definitely his wheelhouse, you know. If I can ask, how do you know Peter?
I was in IFAS statistics, and Peter would send his students to me. So we'd wind up meeting to talk about IBI, what we called IBI.
Yeah. Well, he recently retired, but he can't stop working. So he's still putting out papers. So yeah.
The maps had all those dots of where ibi are found.
Yeah.
There wasn't much going on around here, but I go down to Paynes Prairie. There's tons of ibi. I see them on the lawns here at Oak Hammock. I guess this is not an important concentration of ibi here locally. What are they doing here? Are they breeding here, not breeding here? What's going on in the Gainesville area?
Yeah, that's a good question. This area is not particularly important from what we've seen for the coastal Alabama breeding population. But clearly, they're here, and they're here during the breeding season, and they're here during the non-breeding season as well. They're here year-round. I don't know if they're breeding every year here, but they will breed in inland areas. So they breed around here. I don't know how consistent that is. There are some huge concentrations of ibises or ibi, whichever you prefer, over in St. Augustine. I don't know. There's a basically an alligator zoo in St. Augustine, and the ibises love that. So there are thousands of birds that will roost and nest there, and I think that there might be some movement just in Florida in general. But yeah, that's a major thing we don't know. Where many of the ibises that we're seeing that aren't tracked, where are they coming from? How long are they staying? They do move around so much, so it's really hard to tell.
So this is probably a question you got when you defended your dissertation. NSF comes, knocks on your door and say, we got $1 million for you to study ibi, to continue your studies on ibi. So what do you do next?
What I would do next, and this actually is a great question to ask after her question, because what she asked is, if there are a lot of birds in the Everglades, Why did they leave and where did they go? We track birds in terms of colony counts a lot in the Everglades. Every year they take planes and they fly over the colonies and they count them. But again, once they leave, we have no idea where they go. And we have no idea how important that region is in terms of rescue effects for other parts of their range. We also don't really know how important that region is for mixing. So again, we saw that our birds, they're not going to the Atlantic at all. They're really not going to the Everglades. They are to a certain degree. We think that South Florida might be somewhat of a mixing area, places like Tampa, where birds from the Atlantic and from the Everglades and birds from the Gulf are kind of meeting either during the breeding or non-breeding season. And that's where we're getting enough genetic mixing to allow that population to be, for it to not be structured. So what I would do, just because I love putting tags on ibises, is I would go out to places like the Everglades in boom years when habitat's great and in years when habitat is not great. And I would put tags out to see where these birds are going. And there's a lot of questions that can be asked. As probably as a lot of you know, the Everglades is in the process of being restored. So they're restoring the flow, which means that more fresh water is going down to the very southern end of Florida. And that's great for ibis because, again, they need that fresh water during the breeding season. So not only could we tell where are they going in the Everglades, are they responding to that restoration, but we could tell in years that are bad, are they moving to places like Alabama? Are they moving up the Atlantic coast to the Carolinas? How are they, how is this Everglades population contributing to that overall connectivity? So that's what I would do.
Do we have any questions on chat?
Wow, you guys asked some really good questions. The quality of questions here has been much better than a lot of other conferences that I've been at. So.
You're in a dangerous area here.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
audience is full of PhDs.
Yeah, exactly.
I had a question. I thought I had seen somewhere that one of the reasons ibis were selected is because they're white and they're easy to determine from satellite or aerial photography. Did you use that in your tracking, or was that just a sideline?
We didn't in our tracking, but this is something I didn't have time for. You can actually use these movements to figure out if a bird is breeding or not, because birds have very specific movement patterns if they're on a nest. They'll stay for a certain amount of time, they'll leave, and then they'll come back. And so from that, you can actually figure out if the bird's breeding. And so I compared the areas where we observe birds probably breeding to areas where aerial surveys have found a lot of ibises breeding to see if they're going to other colonies. So we did look at that data, but we didn't directly use it or incorporate it into any analyses.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yes. Here comes the statistician again. Watch out.
Other possibilities would be drones with cameras attached, because you can get very low as long as you don't disturb the birds, of
Yeah.
course. But did you think about using data from eBird? Because I know they're starting to use eBird data now for population changes over time and
Yeah.
distribution,
Yes.
spatial distribution.
So to answer both of those questions, drones are, they are really coming to the forefront of all wildlife research. And Ethan White inherited a lot of Peter's projects. And what he's doing now is he's sending drones over the Everglades to survey. I'm sorry, kind of eBirds. eBird and Christmas bird counts are two ways people go out, count birds, and report them back. And that can tell us if populations are stable or increasing. And we compared what we found, our notes, to eBird's notes and to Christmas bird counts notes. And those two are saying the population is stable or maybe even increasing. We found that the population is gradually decreasing. And that gave us more evidence that we have an area that needs to be rescued by other areas, but there's probably really productive areas outside of coastal Alabama that are upping those numbers. As I'm moving to publish the population research, I'm probably going to incorporate more of that eBird data into that paper. But yeah.
Okay, well, thank you again. Let's give him a big hand. And you want to come next week because a young person will be speaking about the cacao pod diseases and how that's going to affect us chocoholics. So come again for the 7th out of 6.
I love the talks that y'all